Hi, all, and welcome to China EVs and More, where my co host Lei Xing and I will go over some of the week's most important news coming out of the China EV, AV, and mobility sectors. We will open the room up at around the 40-minute mark to anyone who's keen to ask us any questions. One rule: we appreciate vigorous debate, but let's all be considerate and respectful to each other. What Lei and I discussed today is based on our opinions and should not be taken as investment advice. Even if it sounds like investment advice, it isn't. We encourage those who enjoy this room to please connect with us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter, and of course, tune in again next week. My name is Tu Li, and I am the Managing Director at Sino Auto Insights, a Beijing-based consultancy that helps organizations bring innovative and tech-focused products and services to the transportation and mobility sectors. I write a free weekly newsletter that we pull many of our discussion topics from. You can sign up for it at sinoautoinsights.com, which of course, I encourage you all to do. Lei, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, good evening. Late evening today from my side. My name is Lei, and I am the former chief editor of China Auto Review, which published newsletters and the only tabloid magazine in English focused exclusively on the Chinese auto market. I've spent pretty much the last 20 years on the ground in China, covering the industry. I am now in the US as an independent analyst, consultant, still trying to keep tabs on the rapidly evolving market. Before I get into
Every other day.
before I get into my this week's headlines, just to huge applause to you for just gave a nice presentation, a mile high, over the top overview of the global EV, especially the Chinese EV space. So nice job there, and
Thank
like
you.
I said, I'll cut you some slack for today. So this week we saw a lot of dollar signs in the EV and AV space. So just some numbers to throw out there. 5 billion credit line for Cruise, right? And then the day later, Waymo got 2.5 billion from their existing investors. 300 million investment, these are all dollars, right? For Hesai Technology, the Chinese LiDAR company. Just yesterday, speaking of Hesai, they are supplying one of the LiDARs on Baidu Apollo's latest generation robotaxi in collaboration with ArcFox, the high-end brand from BAIC Motor.
That was a big announcement.
Yeah,
That
that was huge. And a couple of other interesting developments. Recently, last weekend, there were a couple of forums, and the CEO of BYD predicted that by 2030, China is going to have the EV penetration rate of 70%. And right afterwards, NIO's CEO, William Li, he went even further. He said, he predicted that it will be 90%.
Those numbers are just bonkers.
Yeah. So coming back down to earth, currently from January to May, the penetration rate is at nearly 9%. For May alone, it went over 10%. But I guess all we have to do is add 10% each year, and by 2030 we'll get to
But let
90%.
let me add some absolute numbers to that, Lei, so people can get an understanding of the vast amounts of EVs that are going to be sold. Because in China, I think the best year is around 24.5 million. And by 2030, it's targeted or forecasted to get close to 30 million unit sales annually, right? So if we're talking 90% take rate, holy cow, we're basically saying 25 million EVs by 2030. So to me, he's making many assumptions about capacity being available, no supply issues, no technology constraints. So, oh man, but maybe maybe that 90% takes into account that, and he said that as a percentage on purpose. But if we're talking as of today, then again we're talking about 25, 26 million cars in 2030 just in China alone.
Yeah. By the way, I see people raising hands. We will have sort of this one-to-one dialogue for about 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up to question, Q&A. So back to now, January to May was almost a million units, right? So let's not talk about 2030. Let's talk about this year.
Yeah, what I think is still really tough to get my head around is GM has increased by 30% their forecasted investment to 35 billion by 2025. Ford has increased theirs to 30 billion by 2025. So are they just going to press an on-off switch on ICEs because they need to make that transition pretty smooth, right, from a sales standpoint? Otherwise, where's this $35 billion going to come from? And it's a lot easier for the EV startups. I tweeted that, they were wondering, somebody had asked about the N5 and the P5 and how the same car might tarnish the P5 branding. And I said, look, they need to increase capacity and they're going to build these N5s for low margin to no margin to keep the plant going. And then if they see a spike in P5 demand, they'll just switch over to the P5 because it's easy, right? It's just the N5 is just a deconted P5. So manufacturing wise, it's the same thing. We're just adding a couple option packages to it, right? But the legacy automakers, they already have these huge footprints, right? And so if they don't sell a boatload of cars, then they got to close them. And maybe in the grand scheme of things, that's what they're alluding to, right? But I love the fact that GM and Ford have turned the corner and there's no turning back now. How the rest of the United States is going to react, especially because you had tweeted July 8th, Tavares is going to launch his Stellantis electric strategy, right? So that's going to play into the United States where Dodge, Ram are super important brands for them. And then here with Jeep, with a few other brands, Peugeot. So they need to play catch up with the United States. And then they also need to really, really be assertive in China as well. So if we kind of make Stellantis a hybrid between Europe and the United States, then they're right now in Ford's position 5 years ago, caught in no man's land, trying to figure out what to do next. Well, one thing that's for sure is that Baidu has grown tired of sitting on the sidelines when they see other people getting all the headlines, right? So you see Baidu being much more aggressive about patting themselves on the back and promoting their progress. And so I don't really see that changing. Hopefully, we'll get an opportunity to talk to them about it in detail next week. I will give you guys an update if that's the case. But hopefully, we also get to go look at that Art Fox, maybe even get driven around in it a little bit. We shall see. But, I lost you there for a second. And should we talk about some sales numbers of some of these other cars?
Well, we talked about ArcFox not doing well,
Mm-hmm.
Polestar not doing well. Polestar, right? They also made an announcement that they will build a Polestar 3 here in the U.S.
Right.
But that's
And by the way, I got to say, when sales are in the hundreds, you're being kind when you're saying they're not.
well, I mean, Polestar they're just piggybacking on Volvo, right? Because Volvo is doing
Yeah.
well, both here in the U.S. and in China, relatively. So they'll make, they make the S60, right? They're gonna make the next gen XC90 in South Carolina,
Right.
and 3 is a SUV, right? 1 and
Right.
2 are both sedan style, coupe style vehicles. It's important for both the U.S. and the China market.
The Polestar 2, they really thought when it launched that it was going to be able to compete against the Model 3. And obviously that didn't happen. And exporting it to the United States, they eat most of that 27.5% tariff. So it's definitely not profitable for them in the US either. So they're mitigating some risk and they're going to the sweet spot by building an SUV in the United States to avoid that lift, that tariff that they'd have to pay otherwise if they were to manufacture in China. So, but man, hundreds. Like if you invest $500 million in a platform and manufacture the car, get the plant all set up, buy the parts, prime the pump, expecting to get 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 a month, and you're only at a few hundred, I mean, you're bleeding all kinds of money. So I don't know what they're doing to. It's hard selling cars in China. Selling cars in general is hard, but hundreds is pathetic. Do they not understand their customer? That's obvious. But are there structural issues? I don't know.
Yeah, Polestar I think is just in a weird spot, positioning wise, and of all those brands that on that latest Geely Group structure and brand map, right? You look at that, and even for me, it's hard to
Oh,
digest.
I defer to you on stuff like that. for the Chinese companies, but
And
man, that
then
looks complicated.
yeah, and then
That look
speaking of
complicated.
sales and Geely, so we talked about this earlier in the show. Zeekr, they stopped taking reservations because their deliverable vehicle is all sold out. I think that was another
Right.
marketing stunt. Just kind of to say, hey, the order intake is well. We're not gonna take any more orders. But yeah,
But Lei, this is how ridiculous it is. Before we build job one,
yeah.
we've sold out.
So, so
Before we build
yeah,
anything,
so
we've sold
in
out.
Chinese there's the Hesai, which means Versailles. It means that you're trying to show off without showing off, right?
Right.
So uh
In English, we call that humble brag. We
oh,
call that
okay.
humble brag.
I learned a new word today.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but another
So
interesting thing is though the Zeekr. They gave out some numbers. So their average selling price for their order intake was 335,000, which is right above what the Li Auto One sells, right? 328,000.
right.
That's pretty high for. I mean, it's a high end brand, but it's pretty good, I thought. And according to my knowledge, it's about 8,000 to 9,000 units. Let's just say 10,000, right? That they said this year they
Hmm.
plan to produce and deliver about that amount of.
Which is pretty conservative. Which is a
Yeah,
pretty conservative number, I think.
it's yeah conservative, but it's okay. It's good enough, and they do have this special dedicated production plan in Ningbo. So
Right.
that's yeah, that's I mean, so I guess these Chinese brands are these new ones, new brands just announced in April that they can go up there in terms of pricing and the way how they
Hmm.
operated, right? The CEO, they speak directly to the customers, the potential customers, and they're going to launch their own app, just like the Neo app. So kind of a user base, right? Community. Everybody's trying to copy that business model. But I mean, I think it was more of marketing. It pissed off some potential customers. And the caveat is they no longer take sort of the refundable reservation. It's a what they call in Chinese small
Right.
reservation. They do still take the big
Yep.
reservation, which is you pay a higher amount to reserve a model. That means you're definitely going to buy it, after June
Yes.
15th. And that, if you do that, then the order won't be delivered until after the Chinese New Year in 2022, so after February. And
Right.
also there's like subsidy issues, right? And they said they promised that it'll be subsidized according to whatever standards.
Yeah, and remember that subsidies are going to go away after
Yeah,
next
it
year,
will
I think,
be
right? So
phased,
I think that's what.
reduction next year. So I think it's the end of actually next year is the last year that there will be subsidies, right? So yeah,
Yeah, with the struggling sales of the foreign automakers, at least the Polestar, the ID4, the only thing I can conclude is that Chinese consumers at that price point are buying domestic brands. Like, because if the EV market is growing and VW is not taking a disproportionate amount of that volume, then it's going somewhere, right?
yeah,
So, and the ID4 is priced really aggressively, right, at 200,000 RMB. So, if no one wants to buy it at 200,000, are they going to Xpeng? Are they going to WM? Are they going to some of these other manufacturers at the 250 price point?
yeah,
They
yeah.
have to be,
I
right?
think
That's the only
this
thing
is
I
a
can
part
conclude.
where the Chinese smart EV startups they have the upper hand because they know the Chinese consumers much better, right? And they started
Agree.
with this
Agree totally.
direct kind of communication sales model and how they approach and interact with the customers. The ID4 has definitely underperformed so far based on April May numbers hovering around 700,000 units, 700 units, 600 units a month, and they just launched the ID6, which is exclusive to Chinese market at a starting price not that
Yep.
much higher than the ID4. So I don't know. I mean, I just think how they priced
So I looked at.
the ID6 is definitely influenced by the ID4 performance a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I would think, by now it'll be thousands, at least four-digit sales
So
numbers.
in the EU, the ID4 is selling in the thousands, but not in the high thousands. I think 12, 1,500 a month. So I have to say, I live in Beijing where most of the German manufacturers are, or all the German manufacturers are. And I just got the impression that there was a bit of arrogance that they're just going to launch this ID4 and sell a boatload of them without really, really raising a finger or lifting a thumb, right? So to your point, I do totally agree that Chinese brands understand the market, understand the customer better, especially when it comes to non-ICE vehicles, right? Because I'm oversimplifying this, and probably for the last 30 years, Volkswagen brand has had it pretty easy, right? I don't think they've spent a disproportionate amount of money on marketing. They've been able to sell a lot of different products up and down the market segments just because of the VW branding on their grill. But it's different. Digital natives, they're much more comfortable with domestic brands. And I think if they expected the ID4 to be a high runner, holy cow, they're in a world of hurt, and they're going to have to make it up somewhere
Yeah,
else.
but obviously, for Volkswagen, they were one of the first. The two joint ventures were one of the first to hit with the chip shortage problem in China. This was back in
Right.
December, November of last year. So I don't know whether that played any role, but I mean, so far the sales are I wouldn't say dismal, but not what I expected.
Pretty close to
Well,
dismal.
like we always say in this room, that we look at it a longer term, and
Yep.
so far it hasn't been that well. June's supposed to be better. June's supposed to be better, even better for Tesla. From what I've
Yeah.
heard. So
Well, again, and what we'll see, because let's look at the long term. But what we'll see is in a growing market, you would expect the ID4 at a 700 per month baseline to grow as well, right? But should they be growing much steeper if it's only incremental growth?
yeah,
No,
and they're even putting the launching the ID3 pretty soon, maybe by the end of this year, which is right. You
right.
would think that it's got to be below the ID4, obviously, and how they're going to price that, 150,000 RMB, right?
Starting September, I think it's going to get super cutthroat because that's traditionally when in the China market sales start significantly increasing. So if the Model Y is fully ramped, I think we're going to see a huge bump in sales for that. And then we'll see whether or not these other companies, whether it's Polestar, whether it's Volkswagen, the ID4, whether they're just slow out of the gate, or do we have a problem, Houston? And should we be pushing the panic button?
Yeah. So Model Y and Model 3 were number 2 and 3 in May registrations, right behind Hongguang Mini EV. So they're still up there.
Can we officially say that they're number one and number two because of the huge price discrepancy between the Wing Hongguang versus the three
Yeah,
Hongguang?
I mean, right. If you showed one of the chart you showed in your presentation was right. The Mini EV was, in terms of price and tech, it was at the very lower left hand corner, right? Yeah, I mean it's a special
Right,
species, so
right.
Tesla's still number one if you delete or if you ignore the Wuling.
Premature demise of Tesla, I think. What was I going? So I wanted to ask you, Luminar. I think they're the ones that raised 300 million.
Hesai.
LiDAR?
Luminar is the one
What's
that
that?
announced the
Oh yeah,
blade design concept, which is right. So the
yeah.
integration, it's about the integration of lidars on roof lines.
300 million is a huge number for a LiDAR company. Does that automatically make them the CATL?
I think we talked about this in the last episode. So Xiaomi is behind it, right? One of the investors behind it. So
Yep.
it's and Hesai is being used on Baidu,
Yeah.
the robotaxis. Cost meaning you don't have to use the most advanced technologies, right? The type of lidar, whether you have spinning parts, right? Whether it's mechanical, whether it's MEMS, whether it's solid state, right? It's definitely not solid state for the robotaxi. So yeah, and Hesai is done. They had a dispute with Velodyne, but they reached the truce. So these local players are getting the upper hand.
Yeah, for sure.
That brings us to the end of this week's show. Lei and I thank you for tuning in. My name is Tu Lee, and you can find me on Twitter at Sino Auto Insight. That's SinoAutoInsight. You can find Lei on Twitter at LeiXing77. That's LEIXING77. If you wouldn't mind rating and or reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you grab your podcast from, we'd appreciate that as well. Even better, if you enjoy this show, please tell your friends about it. Please join us again next week as we track down all the latest news on China, EVs, and more.